Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Amy Kapczynski. I teach here in the law school and I co-direct the Law and Political Economy Project, and I couldn't be more thrilled to have Aziz Rana here with us to talk about his wonderful new book. So the book has recently come out, and there's flyers over there in the corner that have a QR code on them that'll give you a discount. So this is sort of officially part of the many launch celebrations of the book, and so I encourage you, here it is. I'm actually really enjoying working my way through it. It's a fabulous, fabulous book. So I'm just going to do a very brief introduction, and then we'll get to hear from Aziz about the book. So Aziz is the Donald Monan University Professor of Law and Government at Boston College. As that reflects, he has a PhD in political science and a law degree from the law school here, and has an incredibly important scholar of law and government. And his previous book, The Two Faces of American Freedom, is a really, I think, profoundly important synthesis of ideas about settler colonialism and American constitutionalism. And something very characteristic of Aziz's work is his ability to integrate insights about the history of race and empire into the kind of, and make them central to the paradigm of the American Constitution. And you see that also in this book, in his new book, The Constitutional Bind. He's really very distinctive in his ability to think across all of these things so sort of deftly and profoundly. And he's also really, I think, known for and important as a writer beyond these books. So his work in N+1 and in the Boston Review and the New York Times, he's sort of one of our leading intellectuals speaking about and shaping conversations about these issues. He's also on the editorial board of the LPE blog, among many other roles that he plays. So I'm personally grateful to him for that, and just delighted to have him here today. So rather than say more about the incredible book, I'm going to let Aziz do that. And please just join me in welcoming him.
So,
we unfortunately are going to have to ask you. We realize the cameras can't see you there.
okay. Sure.
I'm going to leave the call here.
Oh, okay, great. So, can folks hear me? Great. So first, thank you so much, Amy, for that really lovely introduction. Thank you to all the organizers for bringing me here today. So to Helia and Corinne and Sarah, it's wonderful to get this opportunity to talk with you a little bit about the book. In many ways, the book is a response to the moment that we're all living in. So we're living during striking times in which, in ways small and large, it feels like all of the elements of the American project, the institutional elements, the ethical elements, are coming apart at the seams. And we can see this from events in Gaza all the way to the brittleness of our own electoral system. And the Constitution feels like, in a way, it's a linchpin that links together these various problems. And that sense of it as a linchpin is something that would just be apparent from kind of reflecting on the relationship between our own constitutional dysfunctions and the broader feeling of both paralysis and profoundly undemocratic realities within which we live. And indeed, you don't have to go to law school to have an idea about both the seeming breakdown of the American project and the particular limitations of our own constitutional order. That these are things that are just a product of living in this country at this time and of reflecting on the news that we see around us. I'm not going to even take that much time to go through these limitations and weaknesses because they're quite familiar. We can think of them as, in one way, tied to the system of state-based representation that shapes the entire constitutional system and so essentially denies the principle of one person, one vote in favor of a framework that's profoundly malapportioned. that has implications for gerrymandering at the state level when it comes to the House of Representatives. It has implications for representation in the Senate, where increasingly we're moving toward a world, again, I'm just rehearsing things that are familiar, where 70% of the population live in 30% of the states. And then that also has implications for the presidency because of the Electoral College. And so you have a situation then through both the presidency and the Senate that impacts who ends up on the Supreme Court. So the majority of justices on the Supreme Court were nominated by presidents that had at one point lost the popular vote. And that creates all of this funneling power that both limits the potential for our institutions to address large-scale social problems and at the same time produces outcomes that are far more consistent with small racial and economic elites, pockets within the country than popular will writ large. And of course, that's further intensified by the fact that we have perhaps the hardest amendment process in the world. And so constitutional decision-making goes into a Supreme Court that represents a small slice of the public, and yet it alone becomes the site for meaningful constitutional change because there are not other popular mechanisms. One can go on and on. It's apparent that this does not seem to be a model for effective governance, yet alone any kind of idealized account of liberal democracy. And yet, if you grew up in the United States, like I did, at the end of the last century, the beginning of this one, you would have been taught in school from speeches by politicians in the hagiographic books that were written about the founding generation. Not only that our constitutional system was more or less okay, we're muddling through, but was as close an approximation of ideal liberal principles as possible in political reality. And the book I wanted to write was an explanation for how we could be living in a world that was so patently flawed and yet framed through a culture that was so deeply venerative of precisely those flaws. And the argument that I end up making in the book is that the best way to think of this essential tension is to locate American constitutional veneration as a modern practice in the 20th century against the backdrop of another development that is almost never discussed alongside the story of constitutional law. And that's the fact that over the same years, over the course of the 20th century, the US moves from being a regional settler polity and settler power to a globally hegemonic power. And that the rise of American global authority is directly connected to the rise of a specific vision of constitutional veneration and support, and that the intertwining of both end up shaping the terms of American national identity and how it plays out overseas, as well as domestically at home. And so what I'm going to try to do over the next 40 minutes is essentially just trace out this story. And I'm going to do it through a few different kind of elements teased from the book. So the first is, I want to spend a little bit of time just working through what I mean by constitutional veneration and modern constitutional veneration specifically. And here I'm going to talk about maybe the central concept of the book, a term, Credal constitutionalism, that I draw out in the text. Then I'm going to talk a bit about, well, what was American constitutional culture like 100 years ago, before the cementing of our modern approach? And then from there, I'm going to talk about, well, how is it that constitutional culture changed, and what was the interplay between what we can think of as global developments as well as domestic American practices. And then after working through that, I'm going to end with some reflections for the present. Reflections about scholarship, how it is that we study the Constitution, how much we study the Constitution differently, as well as some final kind of political reflections for the moment, hopefully to bring things full circle. All right. The first thing that I want to note is that when I'm talking about constitutional veneration and support, I mean something very specific, namely the constellation of ideas that sort of are the heart of what we understand to be the American project. And so let me just tease out the elements of them. The first is the idea that the country stands for the principles emblazoned in the Declaration of Independence, that the country has been committed to principles of freedom and equality for all from the founding. This is the idea that I refer to as Credal in the book, following the Swedish sociologist Gunnar Myrdal in his kind of famous landmark study of American race relations that was worked on by some of the leading African-American scholars of the mid-20th century, An American Dilemma. He refers to this idea as the American creed. Now, it's a concept that has anti-slavery roots. It goes back to folks like Frederick Douglass and Lincoln and others that were also involved in elements of abolitionist politics. So that's the idea of the creed. That thought is then connected to the Constitution, namely that to believe in the Constitution is to believe in the creed and to believe that the Constitution fulfills concretely the principles of the Declaration of Independence. That creedal constitutionalism, though, has been joined in American life to a series of other ideological commitments. It's also been joined to an anti-totalitarian civil liberties tradition. Namely, the thought is that what distinguishes the US from Nazi Germany, from the Soviet Union, is that while those are collectivist projects in which the state intervenes continuously in the private autonomous sphere of individuals, what defines the American project as embodied in the Constitution is the idea that there's some separate sphere for individuals free from state intervention, and that there's a range of civil liberties, speech, religion, that come to shape one's own experience in society. That, though, is interestingly also connected to another claim, which is that this private sphere is not just a sphere of speech or religion, but also includes free associative market activities, economic liberty. That the economic realm is something that's also understood as separate from state intervention. And so why it might be appropriate to have various forms of government regulation when it comes to the economy, there's nonetheless a bedrock commitment to property rights and an understanding that civil liberties and economic liberties go hand in hand. So far we have creed, creeds linked to the Constitution, an account of civil liberties, a defense of regulated but nonetheless market capitalism. And then all of that is tied to a vision of representative government that can be thought of as restrained. By this I mean the idea that the primary threats to the liberties that I've just articulated come from a tyranny of the majority, from mass political action. And the best way to balance liberty with self-government is to have a system of representation marked by extensive checks and balances and veto points. So checks and balances at the national level, checks and balances effectively through the veto points of federalism. And moreover, that the kind of pinnacle of this structure of restrained representative government is the court system with the Supreme Court at the top. That the Supreme Court is a kind of insulated body whose function is to preserve the system as a whole, as well as the particular liberties that are associated with it. And so there's a kind of collapsing, effectively, of constitutionalism with the functions, activities, and cultural practices of the Supreme Court. And then all of that is tied to a basic idea that the US is exceptional. Because it's the place where this system has come down to earth, there's something intrinsically special about the national project that then justifies the kind of role that it plays overseas. That it's worthy of global primacy, but even more than global primacy, it's worthy of being treated as a kind of backstop for the entire international system. Its cultural predicates mean that it alone can step inside and outside of legal arrangements, can operate through various forms of discretionary power, because its exercise of international police power sustains the system, and that exercise, again, is appropriate because its foundations are this account of legal constitutionalism. So I want you to notice, that is a lot of different elements that I would say solidify by the time we get to the mid-20th century, none of which have to go together. They make sense as a whole if you grew up in the US, because they're just the drinking water of what it means to be American. It's what you hear at conventions, most recently at the Democratic National Convention, as a kind of romance about the country. But each one of these elements can be taken apart. And indeed, if you were to tell the long history of the US from the founding, there have been ebbs and flows in constitutional support, but this consolidation of constitutional meaning would not have been the dominant one in earlier periods. Just as a snapshot to sort of underscore this point, in the 1850s, rather than the 1950s or the 2020s, if we're talking about constitutional support in the North, probably the dominant way of discussing it within Euro-American settler society would have been a version of constitutional support as articulated by somebody like Daniel Webster, so politician, senator out of Massachusetts. Webster would have referred to the Constitution as a compromise. It's the Compromise of 1787. And its legitimacy comes from the way it's a compromise. It's a compromise between enslavers and non-slaveholding states over the question of slavery. It's a compromise across region over the questions of federal versus local authority. And that these compromises were justified because they were the condition for national growth and development, both material prosperity, but also just territorial expansion. Now, to get a sense of that and to make that less bloodless, just think about what ethically that stands for as a collective project. That is an argument that the reason to venerate the Constitution is because it avoids addressing the evil of slavery so as to engage in a project of native expropriation. Like, that is the very opposite ethically of what in the 20th century Americans come to understand as the constitutional project. And indeed, that tells us something about these constellations of ideas, which is you can back the creed, but reject the Constitution. Many abolitionists did this. You can back the Constitution, but be committed to white supremacy. Throughout most of American history, I would say the dominant position in collective life. You can support creed and Constitution together, as the great African-American activist Paul Robeson did in the mid-20th century, while rejecting all of the other predicates, from capitalism to a restrained account of representative government to a defense of American global hegemony. And so there's something specific about the ways in which over these decades that you have the combination of ideas that comes to be so natural that it's part of our own collective drinking water. Now, to get a sense of how unusual this is, I think it's worthwhile to just go back to the cultural politics around the Constitution in the years before this consolidation. The historical story of the book runs between the first and the second centennials of the Constitution, 1887 to 1987. And the thought behind it is, most histories of the Constitution take you back to the founding. But that's not very useful, actually, to understand the function, role, and cultural place of the Constitution today. It's a product of this century's development. In 1887, during the first centennial, there's a huge amount of difficulty getting off the ground celebrations of the text, something that I discuss in the book. And in response to this, E.L. Godkin, who's a iconoclastic Republican, one of the founders of Nation magazine, he writes a piece saying, it's not a surprise that it's hard to get people to celebrate the Constitution. The Constitution was supposed to do the thing that Daniel Webster articulated. And the Civil War is proof of its profound failure. And indeed, in the late 19th, early 20th century, you had a reality where really the social base in collective life that was committed to some version of this creedal constitutional story were African Americans, particularly African Americans in urban centers, who saw the move from slavery to freedom with the establishment, indeed, of those Reconstruction amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, as redeeming a collective project on terms that might be familiar. But at the same time, their experience as the century progressed was one of slavery to freedom, back to new forms of bondage. And indeed, that created profound splits within the Black counterpublic over the value of effective attachment to any kind of national project, including to the Constitution. You did not have support from Southern white sectionalists who viewed any national symbol, including the Constitution here, as an embodiment of their own political suppression. And then on top of all of that, the increasingly defining question of the late 19th, early 20th centuries was the question of heightened industrialization. the way that the country cohered itself throughout the early period of American life was as a project of settlement. The activity of settlement was what shaped a coherent American national identity. It was the condition by which individuals had access to property. It promoted a vision of small-scale producerist capitalism that shaped collectively Euro-American life. And by the end of the century, for a variety of different reasons, including the rise of large-scale industrial capitalism, those basic terms of social coherence were collapsing. That the country was marked by profound inequalities within settler society over who has access to property, who has access to wealth, and through the intricacy of American institutions, the extent to which corporate power and dominance had become riddled across state, local, national practices. All of this created a reality for new urban and rural reformers, where it seemed like the just basic practices of elections and various forms of territorial and now state governance were not enough to actually intercede to alter the class dynamics that now shaped the country. The most clear example was the nature of the federal courts, the extent to which you had judges that were serving for life, who were largely part of a business bar tied to the railroads. Even if states passed laws, labor legislation that was deeply popular, it would be overturned at the national level. You can think of Lochner and maximum hour laws for bakers, where that's passed essentially unanimously in the state legislature in New York and yet is overturned by federal courts. And this spills over into a broad-ranging conversation about the constitutional system as a whole, because it's a moment in time where effectively only one half of one branch, the House of Representatives, is directly elected, and directly elected by an incredibly small slice of the public writ large. The Senate is still indirectly elected, the President is indirectly elected, and then the Supreme Court. It produces a set of critiques that I'm just gonna throw out there as a way of thinking about the power of these arguments at that moment in time and the ways in which they continue to recur as analysis for our own present, that shape the Socialist Party and then shape emergent Black political formations. The argument from the Socialist Party tied in various ways to arguments by progressives as well as populists is that all of this speaks to a fundamental problem with the Constitution's founding. So Charles Beard, progressive historian, becomes, in a way, the intellectual figure for this analysis. The claim is that rather than fulfilling the principles of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution is a counter-revolutionary document whose purpose was to constrain settler democracy on the ground. And moreover, that then suggests that the problem of the constitutional system is not just that there need to be reforms to particular institutions, let's say reforms to the courts, a simplified amendment process, what have you, direct election of senators. It's that the very way that the founders thought about what a constitution is has to be confronted and rejected. And this very way, to use arguments that Sam Moyn, Sam, and Ryan Dorfler have developed, was that a constitution is a fundamental law. It stands above ordinary law, and its function is to constrain democratic power. The argument that socialists made instead was that a constitution should be thought of as a blueprint for collective political action that is negotiated and renegotiated continuously in ways that collapse, not entirely, but largely that divide between higher and ordinary law. It required moves toward proportional representation, parliamentary, some version of mass parliamentary democracy. It required changing the rights embedded in the text so that they're far more expansive to include socioeconomic rights and a whole host of positive provisions, to understand what a constitution is as something that is far more detailed than typically noted. By the way, this is in fact what many constitutions around the world look like. The US Constitution is 7,000 words long. The average constitution globally is 20,000 words long. It needs to be much simpler to amend. And this was tied also, very critically, for progressives, socialists, and populists, to a vision that linked together economic self-rule, democracy, and rights. In other words, The thought was the only way that the mass of working people would be able to actually control the terms of economic life in a profoundly unequal society was if the rules, the procedural rules of the game were changed so that they in fact had the power to intercede. Because the nature of collective life was such that the only thing that poor and working people had was their collective organizational capacity and the right to vote. While for those that were socioeconomic elites, they could use their privilege and influence and the invisible government, this was the language of the time, to intercede at all of the different levels of political and economic order to impose their ends, even if those ends had very little popular support. And so to have a framework that ensured that people could negotiate the constitutional system was essential to dealing with the substantive economic ends that they wanted, that there's no divide ultimately between process and substance. And moreover, they had a theory of rights that said the best way to protect rights was not to have insulated elites whose history of protecting rights was very clearly on behalf of enslavers, of corporate elites, of various other kinds of pockets of cultural power and authority. The best way to actually preserve rights was to have intermediary institutions that could stand between the individual and government. And here, in particular, they're thinking of things like labor unions, parties, various other kinds of civic associations that are sites for the organization of mass political power that stand as a government behind the government, that create an organic cultural world in which a movement culture around a very different conception of political and ethical life can take hold rather than the received culture of hierarchy and dominance. And that unless you had those institutions, it's very unlikely that any kind of state structure would in fact end up protecting the type of individual rights that they would want, including, for instance, rights of dissent. Because the whole thought was that dissent was central to be able to contest the power of state authority. At the same time, you had the emergence of Black radical traditions who were thinking about the weaknesses of Reconstruction and the reasons why, despite Reconstruction's really profound successes that I don't want to undercut here, that it ended up being so decisively defeated. And they argued that the typical white progressive or socialist misunderstood the nature of American authoritarianism. American authoritarianism was not just classed, but it was classed and raced. And that the most extreme brands of that authoritarianism existed in the South in societies that were ruled by a white planter elite. So for folks like Hubert Harrison, for Harry Haywood, I can talk more about who these people are, for W.E.B. Du Bois, their argument was that that vision of economic self-rule was essential as well for Black workers across the country and especially in the South. That for them to enjoy freedom, they had to have control over the land base that marked collective life. But that was impossible for the same reasons in a way that socialists were articulating under the existing terms of the political system. And so that you had to alter the terms of political authority, and in particular, you had to break the existing state. So this is one of the things that Du Bois says that even progressives are hesitant to talk about, which is what he called the national taboo of the state. As long as the state is the central unit of American political governance, it is impossible to confront the reality of white supremacy in the country. And so a variety of different Black figures said that alongside the types of proposals you're getting from white socialists, you would also need to take that area, especially between Eastern Virginia and Eastern Texas, and create fundamentally different political administrative units organized around the majorities of poor white and Black workers, so as to create a fundamentally different unit of political collective power that's capable then of implementing basic changes to the land, altering the terms of economic distribution, ownership, and sovereignty. Okay. If this is the world, in a way, of critique that dominates, I want to note two things about the late 19th, early 20th century before saying how this starts to shift. The first thing is, from the perspective of dominant white society at the time, it is much more imaginable in 1900 to conceive of a world 100 years hence that has a fundamentally different constitution than to conceive of a world that holds on to the old constitution, but through a narrative of multiracial liberal democracy. And so there's a dramatic flip that's taking place in collective life. In 1912, 3 of the 4 presidential candidates, Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, who wins, Eugene Debs, 3 of the 4 candidates are committed to some version of fairly dramatic constitutional change. Only one of those candidates is committed to anything approximating an account of racial equality. That's Debs. And indeed, Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, when he wins the presidency in the first decade of the 20th century, he sends part of the Pacific Fleet on a tour of Australia and New Zealand after Japan defeats Russia in war, to say that just like the US, those 2 are white man's country because they're all settler siblings within a British imperial cultural world. They're essentially European outposts in the non-European world. The second point to note is that arguments about whether or not you should have constitutional change are absolutely mainstream arguments. They might not be enough to win the day as a matter of having a new constitutional convention, but the first 2 decades of the 20th century are a period of intense constitution tinkering. There are 4 amendments. Just think of how weak this amendment process was even in the 1910s. There are 4 amendments nonetheless on some of the most significant issues of the day that get ratified between 1913 and 1920. So what happens? The argument that I make in the book, and here I think I'm going to have to speed up for the rest. The argument that I make in the book is that we cannot understand the profound transformations in American constitutional culture without locating it against a global backdrop, and in particular, a global backdrop marked by 2 related developments. The collapse of the European imperial system, that's a product of the 2 world wars that essentially completely exhaust all of the European powers and then create a kind of vacuum for a new international order, and the realities of global decolonization that end up shaping the entire 20th century. The rise in political self-assertiveness of non-white peoples that have been colonized, and then in the context of the collapse of the imperial system, the emergence effectively of new national liberation movements that transform an imperial order into one that is at least formally marked by the sovereign equality of nation states. This development has profound effects on the national identity of all the European powers, not just the US, but also England, France, Germany, you name it. We're all, by the time we get to the second half of the 20th century, end up developing some version of liberal nationalism, civic nationalism predicated on the formal equality of its members, as the foundation for their own basic identities. What's striking about the American story is the version of liberal nationalism that develops. So that there are many versions that are out there. That's not what's original about the US. The version that develops in the US is one that is directly tied to constitutionalism. And to understand why, and I trace this through the Spanish-Cuban-American War, the US's occupation of the Philippines, Puerto Rico, World War I, World War II, and the Cold War. But in broad strokes, the argument is that the US finds itself at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, in this moment of really cultural crisis because of the collapse of the traditional forms of settler solidarity that linked collective life against the backdrop of industrialization and class conflict. You had a range of leaders that then saw turning to the global stage, opening up markets, having new frontiers in a context in which the American frontier is effectively closed, as a way of bringing in material benefits. And you had some range of those folks that are like, you know what we should do? We should just replicate the old European empires. But the US is a late comer to the imperial scramble for land. It finds itself embedded in intense guerrilla conflicts in places like the Philippines. And steadily over the first half of the 20th century, what it does is it comes to articulate another theory of American power, which is the US and American power is not like European empire. It's not a project of extraction. Instead, what the US does is it spreads a principle of constitutionalism, because what makes the country culturally distinct is it's where the Constitution came down to earth. This was a recovery of Republican anti-slavery ideas from the 1860s and 1870s. It's not a surprise that some of the earliest interventionists are themselves part of the Republican Party. So the argument that they make is that what distinguishes American power in a decolonizing world effectively, in a world in which the imperial states are breaking down, is the fact that the US promotes a constitutional system. It might intervene, but it intervenes to help reestablish states on the ground as committed to the kind of state and market principles that are compatible with a stable Pacific global order marked by self-government for all. And in this way, American power and American constitutionalism are coterminous. And it's striking the moments of constitutional veneration that kind of jump. You see them precisely tied to the politics around war. So you see it in the war in the Philippines, where there's the initial development of these ideas. You see it during World War I, where groups like the National Security League that are committed to the war effort start the practice of celebrating Constitution Day, September 17th, that just occurred here. So as mass veneration of the text as a way of linking the Constitution to the war project. The next great moment of constitutional veneration takes place with the 150th anniversary of the so-called Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights, those first 10 amendments, had largely been ignored culturally in American life. 3 states had not even ratified them by the time we get to the late 1930s. But in the lead up to the 150th anniversary, against the backdrop of Nazi Germany and Japan, you have a mass celebration of the Bill of Rights as what distinguishes the US from Nazi Germany. What's striking about that mass celebration is it now has far more buy-in from labor activists, from Black radicals, from civil libertarians. And that's because of the iterative relationship between what's happening globally and what's happening domestically. In other words, this is not just an international story. We have to understand how the typical narration of American constitutional development that's about what happens within the borders is in fact linked to the global. So you have the emergence of constitutional veneration, but then in the 1930s, the Depression brings all of the questions about the existing system back to the fore. And in the mid-1930s is really the last moment where there's a serious debate in this country about not just whether to pack the courts, but whether to fundamentally reform the entire constitutional system. That gets suppressed because of the success of New Deal in overcoming the limitations of the court system. That effectively, the New Deal coalition, working class coalition, is so large, the CIO and those organizations, because of a half-century of organizing, are so powerful that they're able to create durable supermajorities to overcome these veto points, to provide FDR with massive support, like in the 36 election, where 80% of the people in Congress are New Deal supporters of some stripe. And then, with the threat of court packing, but also the transformations in the court through FDR's presidency to reshape the judicial infrastructure to allow something like a limited social welfare state to take off. That creates a context where you have more buy-in, where it's easier in the early 1940s to talk about the country in these civil libertarian terms and then to link it to the text of the Constitution. But something that's always continuous, from the Philippines to World War I to World War II and beyond, is that this linkage of constitutionalism and American power operates on both sides of the legally constrained ledger. So during World War II, for instance, in California, the very same people that are backing Bill of Rights celebrations, that are organizing the Bill of Rights celebrations, are the same folks that are pressing for Japanese internment. And the argument that they're making is that there is a specially distinctive culture of rights, but that culture of rights is under threat from various types of outsiders. And the only way it can be preserved served is to have a security infrastructure that engages in near discretionary and limitless violence, and that security infrastructure is justified because precisely the exceptionalism of the American project ensures that it's going to be oriented in the right direction. Notice what this means, and you can tell this is a story that goes across the century, and indeed we can even see it playing out right now in places like the Middle East when it comes to American foreign policy, that American arguments about constitutionalism both constrain perhaps some of the worst excesses, but the language of constitutionalism is itself a persistent and continuous justification for the further entrenchment of a security infrastructure whose very foundation and basis is an idea of America as unconstrained. These two things are happening together, and indeed constitutionalism in this way is a profoundly imperial settlement. It's an imperial brand of constitutional politics. Now, the final bit of the historical narrative before saying a little bit about some takeaways that I'll mention here, the book goes all the way to the 80s, is what happens in the Cold War, which in a sense solidifies all of the elements of the official story of Credal constitutionalism. Even after the war, it might be the case that you have some New Dealers that are saying that the essence of the constitutional project is the 14th Amendment, is the First Amendment, some combination of civil rights and civil liberties, especially civil liberties. But they're still deeply uncomfortable with what's viewed as a kind of misshapen set of compromises that marks the actual structures of federalism and checks and balances. It's going to be this post-war period where New Dealers and liberals revise their understanding of the court as not just a site of class rule and class domination. Because increasingly, as the US finds itself confronting the Soviet Union, what emerges is an analysis of why other countries like the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany ended up engaging in mass extreme violations of rights. And the claim is that what undermines rights is what was called tyranny of the majority. And indeed, this is the same period that Alexis de Tocqueville's work, Democracy in America, is rediscovered. It had kind of fallen out of scholarly and public commentary from the 1870s to basically the 1930s. And the thought is that too much populism, too much popular authority produces a kind of collectivist attack on rights. Despite the fact, we could discuss that in the US, the actual history of extensive rights constraints on marginalized communities tended to come from various minoritarian dimensions. So like white supremacist elites, the planter class, the judiciary, and it was oftentimes mass political organizing, like the New Deal, like the civil rights movement, that actually provided the expansion of rights. And then this claim, though, that the threat is from tyranny of the majority, produces a desire to find institutions, especially against the backdrop of McCarthyism, that can be sites for holding the tide against tyrannical publics, demagogues, and the court is sort of seen as a central place. And in fact, Yale Law School is one of the key sites for the construction of precisely this argument through the dean, somebody named Rostow, who develops an idea of the Supreme Court as a national seminar, through Alexander Bickel, who's writing on the Supreme Court and judicial review you probably read. So reimagining the court as a cultural space that's free from the kinds of interventions of the public, in which what the court does is it engages in a national conversation that produces intergenerational change across time. All right, takeaways. Scholarly takeaways. The first thing that I want to just note here is that the book, in a way, is an intervention into how we study the Constitution. And it's an intervention based on an historical observation. If we were having a conversation about the Constitution in the early part of the 20th century, the dominant scholars of the Constitution would not be people primarily that teach at law schools. There were some law professors. The primary folks would be historians, political scientists, people like Charles Beer, the historian who's sort of foundational for that counter-revolutionary theory of the Constitution. And the reason would have been self-evident, which is the Constitution was a system of which the courts and what happens on the courts was only one piece. And that to understand this system, you had to understand the courts, but you had to locate it within a broader set of social forces, movements, players, to then recognize how the institutions are operating and how they're changing across time. Law schools were primarily sites for a case method, Langdellian case method that you're all familiar with. The argument would be, using a case method to understand the Constitution makes no sense, because essentially you're taking one thin slice of institutional players, granting to them, basically business judges, the authority to shape the entire terrain of what counts as the constitutional imagination, and then having doctrinal conversations within the terms of their own cultural practices and background over how to proceed. So it doesn't work as an understanding of the Constitution, and it's deeply limited. It's also, in a way, why law schools primarily didn't, in fact, teach constitutional law as a required class until the 20s and 30s, and oftentimes, even at that point, it was a course that was taught in like the third year elective, so it wasn't like so it wasn't everywhere necessarily a required class. It starts becoming required at a time when there's more focus on administrative law. So you have administrative law classes and constitutional law classes against the backdrop of the New Deal. So in a way, an argument that emerges from the book is that part of the reason why we're stuck in this bind is because the methods by which we've come to understand the Constitution are methods that are grounded in a Cold War mentality that essentially forecloses the range of ideas about which we should be engaged in serious negotiation and debate, and that we handed over even the cultural memory of what counts as a constitutional question, frankly, to people like myself. So lawyers and constitutional experts, quote unquote, who have very limited purchase when it comes to making sense of the system as a whole and what kind of system one would want. And we can see this play out pedagogically and also in the scholarship. The rest of your curriculum has this interesting development, which is 100 years ago, the work is very formalistic. The way you study property, the way you study contracts, through these treatises that treat those fields as closed and contained boxes. By contrast, the way people studied the Constitution was deeply anti-formalist, as something that could only be understood as a system responsive to social forces and developments. Today, it can be almost exactly reversed. The story of the rise of US constitutional veneration and the Cold War consolidation of this particular narrative around the closure between the court and the Constitution is one in which your other areas, just think about LPE, just think about even law and economics, are all predicated on the idea that you can't have a closed, four corners of the text way of understanding property without, if you're a law and economics person, without thinking, for instance, about market efficiencies or external principles or bringing to bear other kinds of disciplines. Well, what's happened to con law? It's become the site for a reproduction of an almost scholastic investment in the wisdom of the founders, in a way that does disservice both to the elasticity and depth of our own collective knowledge about the past and to what we need in the present. And so, as political takeaways, and I apologize going a little bit long, we can take a few things about this narrative for the present. One is the particular brand of racial inclusion more generally that came to mark the Credal Project. We're living, when I say that the American project feels like it's coming apart at the seams, we're living in the wake of the breakdown of basic assumptions about how the country would get free and equal. So one of the things that's happened over the last decade is this sense that the country is both post-racial, in that we can have people that are Black or women as presidents, perhaps, but nonetheless it's marked by what folks might call the new Jim Crow. The persistence of structural hierarchies that go back to those settler foundations that have never been acknowledged, let alone addressed, and that require us in the present effectively to think beyond the limited terms that constitutional laws and discipline give to us about what counts as a question about race and equality, that make us obsess, because that's what conservative justices are interested in, over issues of affirmative action, and yet ignore the intricacies of how race and class link together to create durable regimes of authority and privilege. And at the same time, it's essential to reject one of the classic moves in constitutional law and indeed in American discourse that's even there among critics of the Constitution that say we should have a new text, which is a normative nationalism. To talk about the Constitution is to talk about the four corners of the nation and to make alterations, technical alterations to how the existing arrangements operate. No. The American 20th century constitutional story is a story about the rise of an imperial power that was wrapped up with a set of legal practices, that was grounded in a claim about an international rules-based order that operated overseas, that operated domestically, and yet over time has come to impose extreme forms of violence and inequality on various populations, both overseas and at home. And that means that to confront constitutional life is to confront the meaning of American power and its rippling effects, not just for folks in places like Gaza, but also for workers here who find themselves subject to various forms of corporate authority that are the product of transnational property rights that end up feeding back into the way that our institutions are set up, that end up being shaped by the limitations that our political system places on any kind of meaningful change. We are in a moment, this is the last thing that I'll say, in which, in a profound sense, we are past the homilies and the romance of the American story. There is a deep desire among many folks, and I'd say myself included, to want to revive a romance about what might have been possible during a contingent period in American life, the 30s to the 1950s. And yet, just believing in the romance will not in fact solve the problems of the present. We have to confront both the nightmares of what the country finds itself producing, as well as like the resurgent forms, in this way the resurgent forms of white nationalism, and also the emancipatory possibilities that are embedded latently and patently in the forms of organizing that we see. Unless we take that latter path and confront those tensions, we're going to find ourselves essentially revisiting the same kinds of weaknesses in a continuous cycle of disaffection and paralysis, something that I think collectively we can avoid. So thank you.
Let's take a minute and let a few folks leave and probably get to class. Rather than sit here because of the camera, why don't you just stand and take questions as you wish? Does that sound good?
Sorry, my apologies for going long.
This is fabulous. Don't apologize. So I'll start with a question. It really is about where you ended up bringing us to the present day. The book ends in 87, but part of what you adverted to, the story of constitutional laws, formalism, that's even a slightly more modern story, right? That's the story of originalism that consolidates in the 90s. And so I would love to hear you say a little bit about the post-87 period and sort of how you think about what are the forces that drive us toward even this heightened, sort of formalistic constitutional culture. Also, what are the prospects of change? I mean, one thing that I thought, that occurred to me as you were speaking about the kind of takeaways of the book was also that, you have an account that, a historical account of the kind of visions of new constitutional orders that required associative life, right? This is the Du Bois story that you're telling, and those are very weak right now. And so one of the best rejoinders to people who want to, let's say, make one change to the Constitution, like Sam, let's overthrow judicial review, is well, our other institutional structures are really bad too, and where is the form of institutionalized power that could have a more thoroughgoing, that could sort of work a more thoroughgoing change? So that's a kind of, I guess, maybe a few questions into one, but I'm just curious to hear how you think about that.
Yeah, so let me take them as two questions. So one is just in a way closing the loop of the history. So the argument that I make in the book is that folks have an idea of the country that's really a product of very specific developments between the 30s and 50s. The power of the labor movement that could overcome the limitations of the constitutional system, overcome those veto points. The realities of World War II, and especially the confrontation with Nazi Germany, which both fed kind of anti-racist politics within the US, but also built this sense of the specialists of American global authority and the idea that that specialness is tied to civil liberties, to a certain set of principles. And then the Cold War, which, because of the way in which like the confrontation with the Soviet Union became a confrontation over winning hearts and minds in the global South, it also fed the types of developments that ended up producing domestic racial reforms. A country can't be marked by Jim Crow segregation and white supremacy if it's trying to convince Asians and Africans to back it against the Soviet Union. And it moved the center-right and the center-left to a kind of middle ground around social welfare state, limited social welfare state, racial ameliorism. And so it produced this compact that for decades was what people just thought the country was. And then interestingly, you might think that the end of the Cold War would create a kind of reassessment of national identity. But the collapse of the Soviet Union basically created a kind of supercharging, where that version of the country that solidifies in the mid-20th century, a kind of extreme brand of it is then presented as, oh, this is the reason why the US was able to win. This is what's special. So the 90s, you see all of these like incredible panegyrics to the genius of like Hamilton, Washington, whomever else. And then you also have a kind of fundamentalist version of each of the elements of the national project, like a more fundamentalist account of market capitalism, a more fundamentalist defense of like the genius of the justices on the court, almost regardless of ideology. It could be Scalia, it could be Ginsburg, but they're all like superstars and heroes. And in a way, I think where we are now is almost like post-Cold War. But that supercharged version, I would argue, was based on a fairly hollow set of precepts that have come apart at the seams through a series of cultural crises, from the Iraq War, to the financial crisis, to the movement for Black lives, to like a pandemic, to the rise of Trump, you name it. And that's then, in a way, reverted the country as a cultural matter back to something that looks a lot more like the longue durée, which is all of these different ideological pockets, including space for white nationalism and white supremacy as like a powerful ideological position in collective life. And with this center, Cold War, kind of Credal constitutionalism, as still maybe the dominant ideological form, but one that's believed in, I think, almost like nostalgically as what we have to hold on to, rather than proactively as like a vision for the future. It's almost like what David Scott and others called one of our futures past at this point, but that's like very hard to let go. And then that brings to the question of what to do. This is one place where I think my work, though draws absolutely from the work of folks like Sandy Levinson and others, is different than the range of constitutional critics that you're seeing right now. The argument that I make is that the only way to actually address the crises of the constitutional system is through political organizing. That one of the central problems, I think, for liberal common law scholarship right now is that many of the critiques that I articulated are like self-evident. But there's this sense that, yes, it's true, but if you push up against it, like what are the options? Like there's no option. Like if you back rupture, then rupture just opens up all of this norm erosion and violence. And I think that that is a absolutely central insight to keep in mind. But that what it ignores is that the only way you can get meaningful change, and indeed this has been the story, is not by imagining that somehow you're going to be able to convince technocratic elites across an ideological spectrum that you'll have a different constitutional system, but through power building. And so I would argue that some of the most significant reforms to the constitutional system right now are not even necessarily reforms that you think of as directly constitutional. They're precisely the reforms that would build local sort of multiracial coalitions, I would say class-based, to be able to have greater bargaining power, self-organization and assertiveness that would create the kind of organically the type of cultural worlds in which left politics effectively can grow. And that means that far stronger, for instance, like labor rights, union organizing rights, rights to strike, might not be thought of as a constitutional question, but actually precisely in the way that somebody like Akbar talks about non-reformist reforms, could help improvise out of the existing order a different institutional infrastructure, has the potential to push beyond our existing system. And so I would primarily be interested in thinking about, well, how do you actually create the intermediate institutions that Du Bois or Hubert Harrison or Harry Hayward were talking about, or Debs? And then through those kind of thick infrastructures in like the interstices of collective life, push for various kinds of change. The problem, of course, is a time horizon problem. We're living in a moment where it feels apocalyptic. There's a horizon of 60 and yet precisely because we live in a historical period that since the 70s has been one of containment and defeat for left forces. The last real moment of an anti-constitutional imagination was in the late 60s, early 70s, something I talk about in the book. That all of the institutions, those intermediate institutions, have been constrained. And indeed, one of the ways you can just think of the rights attacked on the university right now is part of that project. All the weaknesses of the university is actually embodying principles of equality and justice, the way in which it reproduces class privilege. It's nonetheless understood as an institutional site, as an intermediary site that offers an alternative kind of cultural horizon. And so that requires then defending the existing institutional bases and thinking of reform that links economic, legal, constitutional, that would rebuild them. Should we, so I'm happy to stay as long as
We've
folks want
got
to stick around.
definitely 15 more minutes, and I mean, probably we can go on even a little beyond that.
So should we go
have a
one-
date with some students after at 1:30.
So should we go one at a time, or at this point should we start?
Well, as you wish.
Let's do one, and then if I'm too long, we'll group. I'll try to be shorter. Go ahead and please say your name.
Yeah, my name is Neetika, and I'm a lawyer and a history PhD student. Thank you so much for your presentation. I wanted to ask a few reflections on sort of more insurgent agendas this might open up for comparative con law. So as part of the US imperial agenda that you were outlining, for example, the Ford Foundation sent sort of American con law experts to various parts of the world, including, for example, India, to sort of, and even we can see sort of the legacies of how comparative con law is even done today, right? Like when it's the person at the top of the pyramid doing comparative work, that comparative work is always going to be structured or framed a certain way. Yet the sort of more insurgent way of looking at the Constitution, of focusing people's constitutional movements and struggles for meaning, and what the Constitution has come to mean for people's movements and not necessarily just courts, are also are incredibly strong resonances and parallels that we sort of also see. And I was wondering if sort of like there's sort of ways in which we could chart a new way of doing or thinking about comparative con law that perhaps privileges what the Constitution means to different people and movements, and not just how courts are thinking about it.
Yeah, so I think that's absolutely right. So something that I'll say sometimes is that I think of myself as a scholar of comparative law, like comparative law that's comparative constitutional law. It just happens to be that my case study is the US. And so a few thoughts that kind of emerge from this. One of the things that the book charts is the persistent exercise of the constitutional consultant, oftentimes tied to elite law schools, not always tied to elite law schools, that were very closely connected to the US State Department and other kinds of government agencies that were involved in the writing of constitutions around the world. We start seeing this with Puerto Rico and the Philippines. We see it in the United States with Native American nations and the role of an American constitutional form in shaping the terms of recognition of Indigenous sovereignty from the 30s to the present. And then we see it all the way up to today with even exercises like writing Iraq's constitution. My own view about these projects is that they tend to be deeply limited for fairly obvious reasons in the ways in which they're kind of disconnected from local understandings of actually very rich constitutional traditions that long precede the American project, like the Haudenosaunee people here in North America, and that they also oftentimes cut against the actual aspirations of communities on the ground. But to me, in a way, like this leads to a second point that's almost more interesting, and it's something that Ginsburg noted a decade ago, which is that the US Constitution, as Emily Zakin and Mila Versteeg, scholars have written, is now a global outlet. Like, very few constitutions look like the American Constitution. Most constitutions around the world in countries that are broadly thought of as quote-unquote liberal democracies, though we can contest what that means, much longer, more detailed rights provisions, more flexible institutional orders, constraints on court authority, nothing like the way that our court's structured. So much more common to have significantly larger courts, 34 in India, 16 in Germany, term limits somewhere between 9 and 15 years, a simplified amendment process, all of these things. And so if anything, it feels like the learning now has to really go in the other direction, and yet even feels like comparative common law have been very reticent to think of learning as something that is like a multiple way street. So as an example, whether or not the Chilean Constitution from 2022 ended up getting ratified, it has really interesting provisions about how to negotiate relations between settler and indigenous populations. Same thing with the Ecuadorian Constitution, how to think about environmental rights, natural resources, concurrent forms of sovereignty, ideas of confederation. These are all developments that have emerged on the global stage and should be part of our own domestic conversations. And then a third thing that I think is part of, to me, maybe the most important thing when it comes to American constitutional law that is linked up with insurgent comparative con law strategies, that figures in the global South, and I spent a fair amount of time discussing them, had really interesting interpretations of the lessons they drew from the American experience. Like the things that worked, the things that didn't work, the things that they liked, the things that they didn't like. And none of that has been part of the conversation, either about comparative sort of like transnational learning or about the stories we tell about the US. So if you were to talk to people like Eric Williams or Oginga Odinga in Kenya, someone who plays a significant role in the book because of the US's involvement through Thurgood Marshall in the writing of Kenya's first constitution, they would say federalism is actually something that's really interesting that the US developed, but not the federalism as this like double security of individuals that's a constraint on democratic power, but thinking about confederation as a way of managing plural populations. But like none of that is actually part of the American story, because if you were to take that seriously, then you'd have to invest precisely in like, well, how do we think about settler-native relations? And how does that tie to the kinds of intergroup conflict that might mark other parts of the world? This is the type of work, for instance, that Asla Bali, who teaches here, works on. But that's part of a long tradition of learning about the American Constitutional Project. Or similarly, there's a lot of analysis elsewhere about why the particular combination of civil and economic liberty that's so just like sensical to the American constitutional story actually fails as a project of redistribution and reform, both in the US when we think about Reconstruction and Reconstruction's failure, but also in decolonization. Because it's all predicated basically on a rejection of any kind of reparative obligation and an inability to think about what happens to the land, what happens to material economic resources as really central for creating something like a genuinely egalitarian society. Now, these are questions that comparative con law could put front and center by not treating, for instance, settler colonialism or decolonization as side stories, but as actual legal concepts that help us navigate the big questions that we have about empire, about race and inclusion, about labor, and about the structures of capitalism. All right, let's do a couple together because I did go too long.
So I'll get the coffee ticket so I can wait.
Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Mikey McGovern, postdoc at the Yale Law School ISP, but History and African American Studies PhD. So I want to ask about Credal constitutionalism and your sort of view of the Myrdalian project, because as soon as you said that, my mind went to Maribel Mori's work on, Myrtle and the Carnegie Corporation, and how, in a way, what an American dilemma and the whole project behind it embodied was a kind of was a preservation of a kind of earlier white supremacist world order based in, European nation states and their own imperial projects. So when I hear you talk about it, it sort of sounds like, okay, we bring in the Myrdalian frame to sort of redeem some of the asymmetries in the settler colonialist constitutional project. But if you read it, I guess, through that even more critical lens, what that adds to it is this sort of dimension of old world empire of philanthropic organizations, putting in power benevolent monarchs, etc. And so what is that view of the Credal project do to this phrase, and how you might kind of work that into your analysis?
No, I think that's a great, thank you very much. And I really appreciate you mentioning Maribel's book. So White Philanthropy, it's a terrific book. I recommend that folks read it. So my analysis of what Myrdal is arguing, and I do think it's really important that it's against the backdrop of World War II and the collapse of the imperial system and the rise of American global power. And Myrdal is a Swedish social democrat. His basic understanding of global politics is shaped by some version of the European center-left. His idea about the US Constitution, interestingly, is really drawn from Charles Beard, but the Beard of 1913. So he thinks of the Constitution as a counter-revolutionary, anti-democratic document. But he's also looking at the US at this moment in time. And, he's committed to the thought that the US can both carry on some of the principles that undergird the European world, and yet be a break from the extractive project of the European empires. And that shapes a lot of how he ends up framing the question of the creed. Because what he does is he says, look, the US is marked by local prejudices, that, this is discrimination, segregation, but they operate at a local plane. There's nonetheless this higher plane of the Declaration of Independence. And it's this higher plane that means that the country, the US, could actually be something else on the global stage. It doesn't actually have to replicate only the worst elements of the European project. It can take from European civilization, effectively, its best principles, and combine it with the ideas of the Declaration, in which there's universal equality for all in a world that is effectively going to be marked by free and equal nation states. And he very much then makes the claim that if the US were to redeem itself by claiming this higher principle, this creed, he's not saying it's definitive that it will. He does argue that it's the main trend or direction of American history. Then it can be something profoundly different on the global stage. And this is why I think it's important. And with respect to the Constitution, then he argues that, look, I think the Constitution is basically this counter-revolutionary class document, but for whatever reason, these New Dealers seem to love it. So if they want to combine it with the Creed, sure, it could serve that symbolic aim. The thing that I think is really key about the constellation of arguments that he's presenting at that moment in time is it tells us something about the drift of white national opinion in the US that we see even to this day. I want to be clear. The argument I'm making is not a cynical argument about white elites essentially grasping for these languages as a way of justifying their own power drives. There is some of that that's going on, but what's made these concepts so durable, even after they feel like they've fallen apart, why people were so enthusiastic about the various speeches at the DNC, is because they tap into a romance that over time, white officials really profoundly, and publics really profoundly believed about the nature of the country, and that folks suffered and died for, whether it's World War II or various elements across the American project, or elements of the Black political establishment, when thinking about things like the Civil Rights Movement. And so this story about it's not determined, just think about like Obama's language, like it's not determined, but there's this potential to be something truly exceptional by redeeming this higher plane and treating the racism and settlers, settler expropriation of native land as something that takes place on the local level, ends up having a really powerful kind of cultural effect. And I think part of the reason why the book hits at that moment in time is because it's this incredible synthesis of the settler past with a new way of thinking about what American power can be. And in this way, like another way of maybe responding to the question is to say, sometimes historians periodize American power by saying it was a settler country, it had like this experiment with direct European-style colonization in the Philippines and Puerto Rico, and then it became this hegemon that's like a civic nation, maybe it's not even imperial. And I would argue that what happens in the 20th century is that the temporalities all collapse, and that there's this interesting melding where the identity of the country fundamentally changes. People don't think of the country in settler terms, and yet the institutional practices have all three kind of joined together in various complicated ways.
There are actually a few questions online, and we should probably wrap up in just a couple minutes, so
Do you want to just read them to me and I'll
Yeah, okay, so they're a very different nature. So the first one, do you support giving presidents, each president 2 SCOTUS nominees every 4 years term, adding 3 justices to unpack the court? And so do you, sort of how would one do that? And so I guess that's a question sort of about like, do you have a position on some of the current debates about constitutional and particularly court reform? And then the latter, very different kind of question, right? But some characterize today's politics in terms of class conflict and war opposition, with flyover states rebelling and workers in flyover states rebelling against coastal elites. So what do you think of that story?
Yeah, so on the first, I support many of the basic policies that folks have been kind of thinking about creatively when it comes to court reform. I should say, my basic position is, for example, by comparison with what we're seeing in Mexico, like I'd be concerned with just systematic judicial elections for all judges top to bottom. I'd probably want to proceed, this is my own sensibility. So like my own sensibility is I like a radical horizon, but a sense of, let's say, an ethic of political responsibility that tries to retrack what the implications are of breaks and ruptures in the present. And so to think really seriously about how do you build power to get from here to there without collapsing into some of the worst forms of normal erosion that you could imagine. I think that when it comes to judicial reform, it would be much better if we had a significantly larger Supreme Court. So not just like 3 justices. I like the idea of having a Supreme Court that is somewhere, like 16 or 34, where you then have a far greater number of cases that the court could hear it through panels. To avoid a constitutional amendment, I could imagine that you have people cycle in and out of the Supreme Court with term limits that go from something like 9 to 15 years. Along with that, I think even, I would back certain types of carefully constructed jurisdiction removal. I certainly back the abolition of filibuster. I think any kind of reform to the courts has to go hand in hand with the simplification of the amendment process, because as long as court reform still means that the entirety of the constitutional conversation is taking place in the courts, then essentially you're engaged in the same kind of funnel that has been, I think, pretty destructive in American politics. So you need to have reform that also expands the terrain in which constitutional argument can take place. I can imagine creative ways to avoid the need for a constitutional amendment right now because of how difficult it is, but of course, all of this would then go before the current court. And so it suggests that the constitutional bind of the book's title, in a way, is like unavoidable and can only be broken through, again, investing in the kind of mass power that can give democratic authorization to various types of ruptures. I hope that I also oppose for the time being, like, I like the idea of having a constitutional convention. My own view about constitutional conventions is that they make the most sense when you have a revolutionary political base that's able to authorize a convention. Right now, it's telling that the people that want a convention are the convention of states. And so this is an interesting thing. I've been criticized by folks that are more centrist, that at the end of the day, you write this whole book about how terrible the Constitution is, and you end with a set of like intermediate steps that emphasize power building, and that you kind of criticize the idea of having a second convention in the moment. And my response to that is, that's precisely because the book is aiming to think not like a legal expert. The way a legal expert thinks is, here's a problem, here's a technical fix. We live in a political world in which, as central as changing the institutions, is creating an organic cultural space in which you have mass power organized through a movement culture. And that's not, I mean, that requires thinking in different terms about how you link that project with constitutional change over the long direct. On good guys, bad guys. So my own view is, and this ties to this last point, that so one of the things that I'm especially focused on when I think politically is labor. Now, that's not intuitive if one were to read my stuff conceptually, because a lot of my stuff conceptually is about settler colonialism and racial hegemony. But it's a product of a political analysis, which is that in the US, this is a majority white country, that there've been, the country has required particular institutions in order to create something like cross-racial solidarity. And the institution that has been most successful in American history, and we see this globally too, in creating cross-group solidarity, have been labor unions. That's not because I think class is the dominant category or that labor unions are the most important institutions. It's just like, it's the thing concretely that has done this work. And indeed, for all the racism of the labor movement, of various labor unions, it's been a central node, and we're seeing this even now in the context of Gaza, of linking together different kinds of political claims that typically are viewed as separate, foreign and domestic, race and class. And that one of the things that happened in this country over the last century, last half century really, is the systematic assault by the right on the union. And against a backdrop in which the country also was effectively resegregated. What it meant was that if you are a white person that is not college educated and live in large chunks of the country, there are vanishingly few spaces where you actually engage in interracial solidarity conversation, and also in which left ideas are just organically part of your life. Do you not see, the unions are gone, the workplace is deeply hierarchical, the church is organized in a way that's profoundly segregated, the communities are profoundly segregated, and indeed they're segregated in ways that are different than what we see in the cities, where you might have minority populations living alongside upper middle class, mobile, highly educated white populations that are creating very specific kinds of coalitions that work for the modern Democratic Party. But in various other exurbs and rural spaces, you might have white people across different class backgrounds, none of whom have a college education, but are deeply connected culturally. And the whole what's the matter with Kansas argument, I think, misses this, because it imagines that if you just walk in as an outsider into a cultural space that you're completely isolated from. So I walk in to certain cultural spaces and I'm like, you know what? It's in your interest to vote for Harris because of like the small business tax break that you might get. Like, that does not work, because it's coming, like a single rational argument about economic interest is coming up against an entire world that's built multi-generationally over how people experience schools, neighborhoods, churches, workplaces. And in a sense then, the thought I have is that we should not first we shouldn't engage in the kind of demonization of the white working class that I think has become common in various elements of American politics. That's maybe, a bit of a straw man. But I think part of a project of constitutional change, which again wouldn't think of necessarily, is like, well, how do you build supermajorities in this country? It's going to require some degree of party realignment. And that's going to require altering the cultural worlds that a significant portion, or at least some portion of white working class actually inhabit. And that's just as important as broad narrative. To me, and it's the last thing I'll say, a huge problem of Democratic Party's establishment over the last few decades, and I think got supercharged in a way by Obama, is this belief that if you have the most charismatic version of a specific story about the country that in a way made sense some decades ago, that would unlock all of these like hardened political realities, that you'd be able to just like convince everybody of the ethical, if not like empirical truth of the national story. And I think the last decade highlights that no matter how charismatic that person is, there are these like profound conflicts of interest and also profound cultural differences that are the site upon which organizing has to take place. It's why a final kind of, let's say, pragmatic political claim that I make in the book is that I don't believe, I'm not a Credal constitutionalist, frankly, of any kind, but I don't believe that the response is therefore to say to people that believe deeply in this vision of the story, like, you're wrong. I think the response is to think pluralistically about a country that can have many different narratives, but can be organized by sharing material interests, by operating in common cultural spaces, by building solidarity to pursue change that could even be radical change among people that might be socialist internationalist, a Credal constitutionalist, or some other element of identity. And too much of American politics is predicated on jumping between two poles. One is we can convince people by making rational arguments about their material self-interest. Doesn't work. The second is we can convince people if we get a generationally articulate person to say the words in ways that are better than what I can say. Also doesn't work. Both of these avoid actually thinking about the worlds in which people inhabit and the institutions they occupy.
Thank you. This is fabulous.